Hello, hello. Okay, it's on. I'm actually not going to talk about rollups today, surprisingly. Hello, everyone. My name is Toghrul, and my talk today is going to be called Everything is a PSYOP. And because everything is a PSYOP, nothing is a PSYOP, really. So, and yeah, as was correctly put on the website of ETHIstanbul, I'm a researcher, because I don't really do research, I just complain about things on Twitter. So yeah, social consensus, what is that? So I asked ChatGPT to define it, and it did quite a good job at defining it. So social consensus is a widespread agreement within a community or society on shared norms, values, or beliefs that guide collective behavior. And we are going to start with this thesis. Social consensus supersedes any concrete property. So essentially, if the majority of the stakeholders agree to forgo on enforcing a concrete property, said property is no longer enforceable by the underlying protocol. And there can be many examples, and we'll go for them later. So in other words, concrete properties aren't real. Or are they? Well, let's explore. So can a social consensus of a protocol enforce their view upon anything deployed on top of it? Yes and no. It depends, and again, we'll explore this now. So a social consensus of a protocol can enforce their view upon anything deployed on top of the instance recognized as canonical by them. So what that means is, let's say if Ethereum forks, then Ethereum can control the social consensus majority that forked Ethereum can have a say over all the state that is deployed on that fork. But it doesn't mean that the state actually represents any value. So the social consensus of a protocol can only control the state, but not the value or any tangible properties that that state represents. So, and that's why the argument is that the social consensus of an application deployed on top of the protocol supersedes the social consensus of the protocol. An example would be, I don't know, let's say, again, Ethereum forks tomorrow, there's a malicious majority that forks Ethereum and creates invalid blocks for some reason. Circle can just choose to not recognize it as a canonical fork. And so any USDC deployed on that chain is going to be invalid. It's not going to have any tangible real world value. Knowing crypto, probably someone will still gonna buy it, but it's never gonna be equal to $1 again. And so, in other words, the applications deployed on top of the protocol default to the social consensus of the protocol, but if the social consensus of the application that it was deployed disagrees with the social consensus of the protocol, they can just supersede it and ignore the social consensus of the underlying protocol. So think of it this way, again, like for example, if a malicious majority forks a chain and the social consensus, the majority of the social consensus also aligns with that, and the asset issues on top, and the asset issuer just doesn't do anything, then that chain is recognized as canonical. If they choose to do something, then that chain is no longer recognized as canonical for that specific asset. So if the social consensus of the application contradicts the social consensus of the protocol, a fork or a migration occurs. So what that means is, in case of a fork, the social consensus of the application recognizes an alternative view of the protocol as canonical, as I described before. And then in cases where forks are not possible, and there are examples of that, for example, for example, in the cases of L2s where malicious upgrade happened, for example, then the application just forces the user to migrate to another protocol. So let's say if, I don't know, Optimism has a malicious upgrade tomorrow, then and it's not really possible to fork an L2 in what is the same way that you can fork an L1. The asset issuer can just, USDC, for example, again, can just stop recognizing Optimism as a canonical chain for that asset for like a specific amount of USDC and can just force the users to migrate to Arbitrum, as an example. So for some primitives, such a diversion in social consensus can be benign. So for example, think of like an isolated application, like a ticket issuer that issues NFTs that represent tickets on chain. And those tickets are non-transferable. If there's a diversion, then that's perfectly fine. It doesn't really harm anyone. You just point the users to a new version of the chain or just migrate the users to a different chain. It doesn't really affect the security or anything. But for other primitives, such a scenario can be catastrophic for both the protocol and the application. So for example, take any major asset that is being traded. If the asset issuer disagrees with the social consensus of the protocol, then essentially the situation becomes so that a lot of LP pairs, etc., become valueless, and a lot of people can get rugged potentially. So that creates a bit of a catastrophic scenario for both the protocol and the application potentially. So concrete properties aren't real. There are, and I'll explain why. The previous statement is not right, but like for now, let's assume that the concrete properties aren't real. So an example of a concrete property that can be defined is the consensus of the chain. That's a concrete property. So the consensus of the chain defines the canonical ordering of that chain. So what that means is essentially, in Ethereum, the canonical chain is defined by Gasper, Ethereum's consensus protocol, and essentially you follow the certificates that are produced by Gasper to synchronize with the head of the chain. But there are examples where that wasn't really true. So for example, in 2010, due to an overflow bug in Bitcoin, where somebody managed to exploit a bug and mint 184 million BTC in a transaction, Bitcoin's head of the chain was reorged to patch the bug. So essentially, because of that, 53 blocks were lost, and you had to build a new chain that technically wouldn't have been recognized as canonical by exchanges if it wasn't for the social consensus essentially just agreeing that to orphan the current head of the chain that was building on top of that malicious transaction. Another example of a concrete property is that the state transition function defines the rule for the mutation of the state. So for example, in Ethereum, a state transition function is applied to a transaction and to the existing state to create the new state. So for example, if I send someone 10 ETH, for example, then the state transition function is responsible for checking that I have enough money and then making sure that sufficient amount is moved from my account to the account of the person whom I sent the money to. But that doesn't always hold. So for example, in 2016, due to a DAO hack, Ethereum implemented an irregular state transition to confiscate the hacker funds. So basically what happened, there was this big project called the DAO that was supported by Ethereum Foundation and most of the builders on Ethereum. And they raised quite a lot of money in ETH. I think at the time it was a few percent of the total circulating supply. And basically what happened was there was a bug in the smart contract, and that allowed the hacker to exploit it and basically steal the funds. And it was a big portion of the circulating supply at the time, so the consensus was reached to fork Ethereum and confiscate the hacker funds and basically just assume that the existing state transition function in that particular transaction didn't apply, and they applied a different state transition function. And that also created something that is known as Ethereum Classic. That was a part of the community that disagreed with that action and decided to stick with the original fork of Ethereum that didn't implement this irregular state transition. Another property that is almost universal in every chain is that the custody of user assets is enforced by public key cryptography. Obviously, if the assets are held in a smart contract, it's a bit different, but let's assume for now that in this case, it's only applicable to the assets that are held by the accounts that are not smart contracts. But again, that has been violated before. So for example, in 2020, after the acquisition of Steemit Inc., which was a foundation for a blockchain project called Steemit by Justin Sun, the ever-present antagonist of the space, The social consensus of Steemit attempted to freeze the stake that Justin Sun now held. And it was, when acquiring Steemit, it was actually a big stake. I think he possessed around 20% of all the supply of Steem tokens. And so the community was worried that he was going to do something that the rest of the community disagreed with. But that attempt actually failed because in response, Justin Sun coerced his friends at different centralized exchanges that held user Steem tokens to vote against the freeze. And basically what happened was after this failed attempt to freeze Justin Sun's stake, the community launched a fork of Steem called Hive. And in Hive, his tokens were still frozen. And actually all the assets that were used to vote against the freeze were also frozen. So basically, again, we just ignored the property and the social consensus superseded that concrete property. And then another property is the asset ledger is enforced by the protocol on which said asset is deployed. So what I mean by that is the canonical balances of the assets are enforced by the protocol on which that asset is deployed. So for example, in case of, let's say, Uni, the asset ledger is enforced by Ethereum, and in case of other tokens, it could be other chains. But again, this doesn't always hold. So for example, in 2017, Tron's TRX token launched as an ERC20 token on Ethereum because their chain wasn't ready at the time. So they did the ICO, distribute the ERC tokens. But after a year, Tron, the chain, launched, and basically TRX just migrated to it. So the social consensus stopped recognizing the ERC20 token on Ethereum as canonical, but instead chose to recognize the asset that was issued on Tron as canonical, again violating the concrete property of the assets that was originally deployed. Another more funny, or in case of people who actually bought into those lies, example of this is Pulse Chain. So in 2023, Pulse Chain launched what they called an Ethereum system state copy. So what that essentially means is they forked Ethereum with the entire state. So they didn't just fork the code of the full node and like all the surrounding stuff around validators, etc., but they also forked the entire state, which meant that there were a lot of dead assets on the chain that weren't recognized by the issuers, like USDT, USDC, Uni, and all the other assets were actually not really recognized by anyone. But the Pulse Chain community erroneously believed that unrecognized forks of assets like USDC or USDT have the same value as the canonical assets if paired with the actual canonical assets in a liquidity pool. It was a result of something the founder of Pulse Chain called Hart's Law, which basically argued that assets follow the prices of one another if paired in the pool, regardless of whether they're legit or not. And so the assumption was that those assets are going to be worth a lot. And people actually bought into it and held those assets. But surprise, surprise, those unrecognized forks of established assets are worthless. I think I checked yesterday, and the USDC on Pulse Chain, the unrecognized version, was worth 0.001 cent or something like that. I don't remember. Basically worthless. And so you might assume that based on what I said before, that concrete properties do not matter. And you might be right, and you're also wrong about that. And I'll explain now what I mean by that. So you can either choose to live in a world in which concrete properties do not exist, in which case decentralized protocols, blockchains are just inefficient databases with no redeeming qualities about them, because the only reason why you would really use a blockchain is because of the decentralization and censorship resistance properties that they provide. Otherwise, it's just a very, very inefficient database that you can just replace with AWS, and it'll work much better and will do the same job. Or you can live in a world where guarantees are provided by concrete properties unless overruled by the social consensus of those governing properties. So what that means is, in most cases, the properties hold, but in extraordinary situations, those properties can be superseded by the social consensus decision. But you can still, in most cases, disagree with that social consensus and fork off. Example would be Ethereum Classic again. So to rephrase the original thesis, this is the more correct thesis of my presentation, and it's concrete properties enforce protocol guarantees unless the corresponding social consensus supersedes any concrete property. So if next time somebody tells you that a validating bridge only secures the assets that are bridged from the base layer, this is actually very, very wrong. And remember that the same argument can be applied to literally any other concrete property out there. And thank you very much, and feel free to ask questions.
Any question? Cassandra?
Super interesting. Would you agree that, I want to phrase this correctly, I guess there seems to be some research to be done around concrete properties that have been already agreed upon, for instance, the current most recent hard fork in Ethereum and now the rules that we have, that it's like much easier to reach consensus about each next state transition, let's say, than it is when we want to do an irregular state transition. This requires like the rough social consensus requires so much more work, time, effort, coordination than the predefined. The last checkpoint when we said, okay, this is the social consensus, and now we'll just go from here. Like, it seems like concrete properties have a value in that they allow much more efficiently to make each hop from state transition to state transition, to give that example. Would you agree with this statement?
Yeah, completely. So you default to the concrete properties, you assume that they're correct, and you use the chain or like the application, assuming that those concrete properties hold. Because even if it's possible to violate those concrete properties, especially for larger chains that are very decentralized and have a lot of stakeholders, it's very, very hard to coordinate it. So for example, imagine if Binance for some reason decides to fork Ethereum, and because they disagree with something the Ethereum Foundation did, imagine how much coordination that requires with Circle, all the big applications, all the big infrastructure providers, all the wallets, RPCs, etc. It's a nightmare. And so it's very, very difficult to coordinate it. So you are better off just assuming that those concrete properties hold, and then in case something extraordinary happens, then yeah, you can always just fork off.
Yeah, totally. And to me, this like shows the value that these decentralized ledgers that are so inefficient do have value, because, for instance, without them, it would be very, very difficult to agree on every single state transition without any concrete properties, where every time we would have to do this very hard work of all agreeing what happened.
Yeah, I believe it was an article by Hasu written in like 2020, or I think or either Hasu or Georges, I don't remember who wrote that. It was something along the lines of Ethereum can no longer be forked, and the argument was that because there are so many stablecoin issuers, so many different entities that have power within Ethereum, it's almost impossible to have them to agree on something contentious and basically create such a fork.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.